Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. This is the host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Batya Ungar-Sargon. Her new book is called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Oh boy. As you can imagine, this is a good one. Batya is the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. Before that, she was the opinion editor of The Forward, the largest Jewish media outlet in America. And she's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, the New York Review of Books, Daily, and other publications. She's appeared numerous times on MSNBC, NBC, The Brian Lehrer Show, NPR, and at other media outlets. She holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Batya and I discuss what is news, a brief history of news, what Benjamin Day and Joseph Pulitzer invented, news about labor, corruption, and crime, and what happened to that over the decades, how modern media was invented to empower the poor, and how the media of late has left the poor behind and now caters almost exclusively to the interests of urban upper-class liberals. She identifies three trends that we discuss: respectability counter-revolution, that is, working-class cultures as unworthy of media attention. This is recent trends she's identifying that she says leads to bad news. The second is status revolution. Journalism has shifted from middle class to upper class. And three, advertising has replaced subscriptions as the economic model, and mainly in response to social media and the internet. And then we get into information bubbles, echo chambers, and all the divisiveness that causes. Obviously, we cover Trump and what's happened to the media since then, even more divisive, all the way up to today. The polls continue to show Trump holds some kind of power over the Republican Party, at least a significant portion of it. And he still insists that the media is fake news about the election. We talk about when that began, the Great Awakening, as she calls it, that began roughly in 2014, and then address the radioactive topics of race, gender, and class, and how the media has dealt with that. Anyway, it's a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Again, the book is Bad News. And if you support this podcast, appreciate it. We are almost entirely dependent on your support. So if you can go to skeptic.com/donate, make a donation there. It's tax deductible as it goes to the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. And our mission is education and critical thinking and rationality and science. All right. Thanks for listening. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium, our sponsor and advertiser, the former Great Courses and Great Courses Plus. This is the teaching company. Back in the day, in the 90s, when I was a big customer of theirs, I would order their Great Courses through the mail. They would ship me cassette tapes that I played on a Sony Walkman. Okay, that's how long ago this goes back for me, which is why I appreciate their support of the podcast. They are now a streaming platform, of course, like everybody else is now, and that's a great way to go. Just a single fee for the year. If you do it through the podcast, it's just $99. That's 58% off their normal price for the year. And you get a free trial. So check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer. Get your free trial when you sign up for the $99 for the entire year. Again, 58% off. And you have access to all their great content, videos, courses. Like here's one that seems apropos. I just opened up for this, called After the Plague. I listen to them all on my iPhone when I'm out and about. This is a 24 lecture series or course described as follows: with Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales as your portal into a medieval Europe in the throes of the disease, the Black Death, the plague. Explore how people across the continent reckoned with and responded to the new political, economic, and social realities that emerged during the Black Death. That seems rather relevant for today. After the plague, we are hopefully getting to being after the plague. And it's good to see how people handled this in the past. Not well, often. So let's see if we can learn from that. Anyway, check it out. There's literally hundreds of courses like that you can access, along with the documentary series and other learning modules. So go to Wondrium.com/Shermer. Get your free trial, $99 for the entire year subscription, give you access ad-free to all that great content. And I appreciate their support, and I appreciate your support. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. Your new book is, I love this, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. By the way, I'm an old school guy. I like physical books, and I really appreciate the design of the cover. So you get this kind of crazy backdrop of the history of news through this little window showing the intense flames of that. So since you put woke media, I presume you are a far-right QAnon endorsing rigged election conspiracist who loves just all the Trump and the far-right, right?
Right. Of course, yes. Of course, a right winger. No, I'm a lefty. I still identify as such, although I get asked a lot, like, why? No, I'm definitely on the left. This is a left wing populist critique of where the liberal media has ended up, and how that's been driven by wokeness, how it perpetuates inequality and all that stuff. I'm a Marxist, and so really coming at this from the far left. But they love to criticize you and call you a right winger when they don't agree with you.
That's really funny. Well, I really loved your book. I knew nothing about the history of journalism, but before we get into that, give us a little bit of history of you. Where were you born and raised, and what's your background? How'd you get interested in the media and this whole story?
I'm originally from Boston. We moved around a lot. I went to high school in Israel and then moved back here for college. And I got interested in the media sort of kind of in a roundabout way. I got a PhD at Berkeley, and I had planned to become, a professor and an academic, and accidentally started writing articles. And then there was kind of no going back. I'm sure did you have a similar experience to where you started to feel like speaking to a broader audience was more fulfilling in a way, or because you've sort of also made that same journey,
yes,
correct?
That's right. Yeah, I have a PhD in history of science, and I was going to do the academic route because it's a pretty comfortable life. It's a good gig. You get paid to write and teach and learn and read and when you get tenure, then you're done. It's like the Pope job for life. And but then I just on a whim, my business partner Pat Lindsay, who recently died, she and I started Skeptic in my garage in '92, and it just took off. And around '97 or so, after my first book came out, Why People Believe We're Things, that's the cover above my shoulder there, painting. It did pretty well, and Occidental College, where I was teaching, had a kind of a financial meltdown. They had some misappropriation of funds and bad investments, and they sent out a notice saying all of us non-tenure track faculty would, be put on basically on ice. There's no future here for you. And I thought, well, okay, I'll just make a go of it.
Kidding.
And just write books and publish the magazine. And that'll be my day job, and give public talks and all that. So I was really inspired by Carl Sagan and Stephen Jay Gould, who reached beyond the academic world into the public intellectual realm. And I thought, this is it's still a classroom, right? I mean, what we're doing right now, this is a classroom. It's just that you can reach, in our case, about 100,000 people here rather than 100 people or 25 students or whatever. And so that's obviously your path. So what was your PhD in at Berkeley?
It was in 18th century studies, English literature in the English department, and I studied Locke and Hume, who I've heard you talk about, and the birth of the novel, and sort of the intersection between like the genre birth of novelistic writing and then the political theory at the time. It's just so funny, like talking about it now, it just seems like such a world away. And I think seeing the sort of sorry.
There's your cat. Very nice.
Hopefully she'll settle down. But yes, seeing the just the way that a certain kind of academic thinking has migrated into the mainstream, I think that was really shocking to me, because I thought I had left all of that sort of critical race theory stuff behind me. And then over the course of the last 10 years, it's become totally mainstreamed through the media. And so that was like something that really, my background in academia was very helpful in helping me notice that happening. Because I think for a lot of people, it was less apparent what was happening. But did you guys study like critical
Hmm.
theory and stuff
Hmm.
like that back when you were in
Yeah,
college?
so in my doctoral training, so it was 88 through 92, this was kind of the literary turn
Hmm.
toward postmodernism and, kind of deconstructing texts, which at the time was informative to me because I had kind of a old school philosophy of science that, science is this eternal march, kind of an asymptotic curve toward truth, and we're going to get to objective truth, and it's there to be found, and so on. And that really challenged my beliefs. I thought in a good way. A lot of postmodernism is skepticism of kind of the prevailing dogma of the time,
Yeah.
which does need to be challenged. That's the only way we're going to make progress is if there's
Mm-hmm.
challenges of the
Hmm.
dogma. But then, it just went so far. It just kept going on and on in other fields. I could see it in anthropology and archaeology. And, it's like archaeology. I mean, how is that contaminated with politics? What does that got to do with, last week's elections or whatever? And it's somehow the professors made it fit. And I thought, okay, this is going too far. And then in the 90s, we had that kind of the evolution wars over sociobiology with Gould and Ed Wilson about to what extent human nature has a biological component to it. And then there was the science wars about, science is just another way of knowing. It's no better than other traditions. And it's like, oh, hang on. It's one thing to challenge the scientific method and say, well, okay, there are problems, but it's another thing to say it's no different than any others, right? And of course, you write about that in your book.
Right, but so here's something that surprised me. I do want to know if you still hold that asymptotic view of science, but so we saw recently this flip where you would have if you had told me 10 years ago that there was going to be a pandemic and asked me to predict where the left would be, I would have said, well, they're increasingly Foucauldians, right? They believe in this whole, science is just a way of oppressing the people on the margins of society. It's a narrative like any other. The state uses, bio, weaponry or whatever, not weaponry, but like, regulation in order to force citizens to, to comply. So we must be on the side of resisting that at every turn. Like that's what I would have predicted. But it turned out that's where the right was and the left was on the side of compliance, compliance, compliance. Do whatever the state tells you, or you're a moral pervert. I'm so interested what I have my own theory about why that happened, but I'm so curious what you think of that.
Yeah, it is a curious thing which tribe you're going to be siding with in something like this. In this case, liberals do tend to be skeptical of big corporations. Take someone like Bill Maher, and his kind of anti-vaccination because big pharma, anti-GMOs because Monsanto, and that's a big company, and that's wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
and then yet he wants to follow the science in other areas. Well, okay, so you're kind of picking and choosing. And are you skeptical of big government or big corporations because they all contaminate and have power and conspire to do things? And so it's really hard to predict. I was quite surprised as well about the response on the left. Yes, I mean they tend to be more pro government, except in areas where they don't want it to be. But yeah, so I was surprised too. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so so my thoughts, but I was going to ask you, do you still hold the asymptotic view
Well,
of that
it's kind of a
science is leading
modified version of
towards,
that. I mean, there is
truth?
I'm committed to
Uh-huh.
universal realism. I think there is an objective reality to be known. It's a little cleaner in the physical sciences, a little less so in the biological sciences, and less so still in the social sciences. But there's still truths to be found, even if it's a little messier. And the regression equations have many components to them that you have to control for. And we saw with the replication crisis that there was a lot of p hacking and file drawer problems, and running multiple experiments and only reporting the ones that were significant, and we don't get to hear about the other ones. There was
Right.
a lot of that, and that was more in the social sciences than and medical sciences because those experiments are really hard to run. And those epidemiological studies are so massive with so many components, like why do some people lose weight, not others? Or take something like diet. It's really, really hard to control for all the confounding variables. So, but I don't think it's likely that, Einstein, the combination of Newtonian and Einsteinian physics is going to be dramatically overturned, just kind of fine tuned because that's the way the world actually is. And I think something like Darwin's theory, it might be tweaked a little bit here and there, but it's not going away. And but when you move into the social sciences, maybe if you say something like intelligence, well, what is that? Well, it's a number on an IQ test. Okay, well, what's the test? Let's look at the test. Is it culturally biased? Well, some of the questions are, but some of them aren't. The more abstract reasoning portions of the test are less contaminated by culture. So, by the way, there is an interesting set of studies that I don't know if they've been replicated or not, but that people who read novels, highbrow novels, Jane Austen and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, serious novels, are better at mind reading. They seem to be better at putting themselves into the position of other people's and reading their minds and anticipating what they're thinking. And the theory behind this is that back when
But that's definitely correlation.
Yes, it's correlational. Yes.
I mean, that's definitely correlation. No, people who enjoy reading novels are the same people who are really good at who enjoy thinking what other people are thinking. No.
Yes. Well, right. So, which direction does the causal arrow go? It could be that people that are good at mind reading also happen to like novels, and that's this. It's the B and the A to B rather than reverse. That could be, but I always thought that was rather interesting. But that's an example where it's really hard to determine causality, in complex social issues like that. Or, to get back to your book, if you're dealing with things like race, gender, and class, and what's the cause of inequality? Wow, if you start digging into the social science research, it's really messy. And so you end up with, kind of a left-wing theory and a right-wing theory, and then you have someone like a Thomas Sowell. I've read all his stuff, who has a more global perspective. Americans are obsessed with black and white. Everything is black and white issues. On race.
Yeah.
Whites, blacks, whites, Asians, and so on. And there, someone like Sowell says, hang on, let's look in Asia, or let's look in Europe or Africa or wherever, and look at the differences in tribal groups there that are not black and white differences. They're other causes, economic and family structure and who knows what. And so there, I think it's we can get there. I mean, I think there's a real answer to explanation for income inequality. Why is the Gini index here and it's not that over there? We can get there. It's just a lot harder to do.
Mm-hmm. Is there something that you have changed your mind on in a significant way, throughout your career that you were very certain about, and now you don't believe anymore?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good one. Well, early on, when I was a born again Christian and I was a creationist because I thought that's what you were supposed to be. Although this was not taught at Pepperdine where I went, it was just straight biology. But I thought that's what you're supposed to be. And I remember in graduate school taking a course in evolutionary theory, just evolutionary biology. Bayard Bratstrom was the professor. It was Tuesday nights from 7 to 10. It was a great class. And then he hauled everybody down to this local bar, the 501 Club in Fullerton. It was at Cal State Fullerton. And, and just drinking with the students. Of course, this can't go on anymore, but that's the kind of thing it was back in the 70s, right? And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, this stuff is really true. The creationist stuff is a bunch of bullshit. I was misled, right? And then on political issues, the gun control, I was kind of a youthful libertarian, big Ayn Rand fan and all that, and just let people do whatever they want, just, don't take other people's stuff and don't hurt them, and let's just live and let live. That seems pretty easy until you get into the messy parts of how the world actually works. But so like gun control, it's none of my business what somebody does. If they want a gun, they should have a gun. But then when I got into debating guns for an issue on Skeptic with John Lott, do you know this guy? More guns, less crime. He's on all those Fox News shows because he says, just arm everybody to the teeth and let the last guy stand win, And it's like, well, hang on. But there you see these incredibly messy data sets where, he has all these county by county comparisons to show that where counties where there's more guns, there's less crime because criminals say case the house or the neighborhood. And if they know everyone's armed, they're not going to go there. They're going to go to some neighborhood where they aren't armed. But then you can find equally strong arguments on the other side using the same data sets. And I remember thinking, my goodness, this is really messy. Just this massive data sets with these huge regression equations and multivariate analysis. And it's like, whoa, it seems like your political position could kind of tweak the variables in one direction to make it come out a certain way. That's where you get these problems of p-hacking and file drawer problems and things like that. So the solution to that, though, now we have a solution, is that you post the research you're going to do ahead of time on a public website. These are the experiments I'm going to run. This is the data I'm going to collect. This is how I'm going to analyze it. And I will publish everything here that I did, everything we found, including the null results. And then you can't p-hack. You can't kind of data snoop and just publish the stuff that came out like that. So that was one, gun control. Yeah.
Are there any areas in life where you feel that skepticism makes things worse, or that there should be a different approach, or are there any areas where you're like, this is not a place for skepticism?
Oh, interesting. Yes, but it depends what you mean by that word, skepticism, because it doesn't mean just the automatic gainsaying of anything anyone says or believes. I just don't believe it. No, that would be nihilism, solipsism in its extreme form. There are no truths, or postmodernism in its extreme form. No, we believe lots of things. The Big Bang happened, evolution happened, and so forth. Climate change is a good example. Are you a global warming skeptic, or are you skeptical of the global warming skeptics? In this case, another example of where I changed my mind. In the 70s and 80s, during the kind of heyday of the environmental movement taking off, and people like Paul Ehrlich, predicting, the end of civilization and doomsday, and billions of people will starve to death, and all precious resources will run out. Peak oil, we've hit peak oil in like 1988. We'll be completely out of oil by 1996. None of this happened, right? Nothing happened. So, by the time, like Al Gore was making his movie, and I saw him give his talk at TED, he had the little cherry picker thing with the pointer going up toward the ceiling of CO2 gases and so forth. And I thought, oh, come on, this has got to be a bunch of bullshit. It's just more, kind of doomsdayism. But then by like the mid 2000s or so, mid to late 2000s, it was pretty evident that, climate change is real and human caused. I'm still not on board with the doomsdayism. I don't think, it's an existential threat like nuclear weapons, say, or Putin with his finger on the nuclear weapons. It's not like that, but it's, it's a problem that's solvable. So that would be, I think, an example where I've kind of nudged my beliefs based on the evidence, in a Bayesian way, just kind of adjusting my priors with new evidence, which is what you're supposed to do. And, I try to do that. And, so that would be a good example. So So just that would be an area where if there is a consensus, like, the vaccines are good, climate change is real, and, 99% of scientists say so, it doesn't mean that the 1% or 3% in the case of climate are wrong. It's just that they're not very likely to be right. And so when people throw up examples like, well, here the majority of scientists believed X, and then look, this little guy over here turned out to be right. Yeah, but that's a survivor bias. You're picking the ones where the person turned out to be right. Oh, look, Einstein. He showed Newton was wrong and everybody thought he was crazy, but it turned out he was right. Yeah, well, but, you're forgetting all the other people over the centuries that had alternative theories to Newton and the problems that Einstein was dealing with. And they were wrong. We just never hear about them.
Do you look at, the way, for example, the CDC has handled itself throughout the pandemic, or, the scientific community, and ever think like, that they've, sort of, that they had a responsibility in terms of the public they were supposed to be educating, that they maybe fell short of?
Yeah, they did fall short of, for sure. Well, there the problem, though, is the story was always changing, right? New information was coming out, and there was just so much uncertainty. And getting information from China was not reliable. We shouldn't have been surprised about that, but there it is.
Yeah.
And just take the lab leak hypothesis. That was on the table for a while, say March, April, May of 2020. Then all of a sudden it became taboo. Like, oh, that's just a crazy conspiracy theory. It was never a conspiracy theory. It wasn't that no one thought that the Chinese intentionally built this bioweapon and unleashed it on themselves for some crazy reason, and then it migrated to the West. It was that it was an accident, a lab leak accident. These things happen, right? Lab leaks happen.
Right.
And
right.
so it wasn't until, remember when Jon Stewart appeared on, I don't know, it was The Daily Show or one of those, where he started talking about the lab leak. It's literally called the Institute of Virology. It's right there in the name. They make viruses here. Oh, and then all of a sudden it became okay to discuss this again. And I had Matt Ridley on the show, and he's got that book with Alina Chen and called Viral, and they kind of present it like in terms of a Bayesian reasoning, it's 50-50 lab hypothesis versus zoonomic, came from a bat or whatever. Either one's an accident, but when you don't know, it should just be okay to say we just don't know. And the problem with CDC and politicians and policy analysts, they have to give an opinion. I mean, I try to be empathetic, right? I imagine standing there in front of the microphones, and someone like you from Newsweek or someone from the New York Times says, "Okay, what's the answer? What do we do? Masks or no masks today?" And then the mayor has to decide: am I going to impose masks on Los Angeles or am I not? And he has to make a yes or no decision when the information is not really there to really make that yes or no decision. And that seems to be a problem.
Yeah, I think, I guess what I'm curious what you think about this is like so much of the scientific community today, quote unquote, seems very aligned with one side of a very polarized elite, let's call it, because I don't think the nation is as polarized as the elites are, who get a lot of power out of polarization. And as a result, because they are so identified with the institutions that are overwhelmingly staffed by and affiliated with the liberal side of things and the liberal elites and liberal politicians increasingly, that they took it so far as to undermine, it seemed to me, like the scientific method itself when it came to COVID. Like there was so much pressure to be part of that monoculture saying the one thing and the one side that it was like they didn't go out there and say like, look, we're not sure, but why don't we try this and see if it works? And then when it turned out that it didn't work, say, oh, actually, the other side was right about this little, thing, but let's try this thing now. Or there was a lot of gaslighting, when it turned out that the other side got certain things right. And I think that served to undermine the claims of the scientific community at a time when the American people needed most to be able to trust them. And for example, like with the vaccine, like I believe the vaccine is very effective at keeping people from dying of COVID. Like it does seem like the data really shows that, but it's especially with Omicron seemed much less effective at preventing people from spreading it or getting it. And there was just no recognition of that after the president himself was saying, backed by all of these scientists and all these doctors, et cetera, saying you won't spread it if you get the vaccine, and then it turned out that was no longer the case. There was no sort of public recognition of that, of the fact that things changed, but that I guess because the claims were being put to use in such an effective political way. And I think that I just worry about what that means in terms of the future of, people who don't have that, college education, who do suddenly feel like actually all these scientists are full of it. They don't know what they're talking about and there's no such thing as science. You know what I'm saying? Do you think about that?
Yes.
Like there was specifically about skepticism, like it became skepticism about these issues became an immoral thing to express, and it put you on the side of the deplorables. And I think that is actually objectively undermining of the scientific method. What do you think about all of this?
Yes, I think we would have been far better served if the information was presented in a kind of Bayesian way, although you don't have to use these terms like priors and your credence and all that, but just to say something like, we're not sure to what extent the vaccines will prevent the spread. It'll certainly help, lower the hospitalization rates and death rates, but you can probably still spread it. The argument at the time was that if your symptoms are cut way back, you're sneezing less, you're coughing less, so there's less particulate matter coming out of your mouth spreading to other people. That was the explanation, although it wasn't clear that was really happening. And in any case, therefore the masks and no masks and all the kind of contra information. And again, I guess when someone shoves a mic in your face and says, tell us what to do, what's the answer? it's hard to say, well, there's a 61% chance that, if you get vaccinated and wear the mask, that, you won't be hospitalized and you won't spread it, or whatever combination. Well, what does that mean, 61%? People don't even understand this with the weather. It's like there's a 50% chance of rain today. What does that mean? When you poll people, they don't actually know what it means. They think, well, it'll rain at half the day, or half the area will be rained on. They don't think, well, if we ran today's experiment 100 times, 50 times it rains, right? Or,
Right.
Hillary
Right.
had a 70% chance of beating Donald Trump, like the week before the election, right? Well, what happened? How did the pollsters all get it wrong? They didn't. That if you ran that election 100 times, Hillary wins it 70 times, Trump wins it 30 times, and this is one of the 30. Right. But people don't really understand how to think like that, even something basic
Yeah.
like that, which is pretty easy to teach. To me, I think this should all be taught in like middle school, high school, instead of algebra, trig, geometry, algebra, trig, and all that, which is important if you want to go into engineering or whatever. But why force everybody to go through that? Why not just a basic how to, statistics and probabilities course, how to reason, how to use rationality, like Steve Pinker's new book, really basic stuff that people don't get in school.
I guess I'm a populist, so I feel like equating knowledge and information, a certain way of thinking, with correct policy is dangerous. Like I think the problem was, like, I believe in the wisdom of crowds, and I think the people were very turned out to have been very right about COVID in a lot of ways. And the elites turned out to be really wrong. I'm sure this is like totally, you don't believe in any of this, but
It depends.
I worry about,
What do you mean by populist? Let's deconstruct that word. You mean vox populi, like
like I
Rousseau,
think that
the people?
I think that like democracy means people have the right to be wrong about things and still have their way, like try things out. And even if the elites believe these are not in their economic interest, the meaning of a democracy is that the people get to choose. And having some sort of like, scientific or objective measure of what is in their interests. I think COVID was just the perfect example of how complex it is to measure interests. And so often the thing that's imposed on them by, their betters, the more educated, the meritocratic elite, actually is not in their interest, because people know what's in their interest. They know what's in the interest of their children. They don't tend to do things that are bad for their children. And so I guess, I don't think that the problem is a lack of information. I think that the problem is a lack of respect for what people want. Like they just don't want to give it to them, like, there's so many examples of this, like in the media, but I mean, the one I'm thinking about the most right now is Hunter Biden's laptop, which was like totally suppressed consciously by the media, to where like he didn't even have to deny that it was his laptop. Like, I don't think people understand the degree to which that is crazy. Like, the New York Times did not even ask him to deny that it was his laptop. They did that work for him. The paper of record did that work for him. The son of the person who was about to become their president, because they wanted that president. And that's like, they what were they protecting people from? Like, they were protecting the working class from their choice, which was the person who was siding with the economy as opposed to the restrictions when it came to COVID. That's what the 2020 election was about. So it's just one, the latest example of how, it seems to me like there's a lot about this in the book, but we often take things that are class interests of the elites, that are markers of taste and aesthetics, and we dress them up as information and truth and virtue. And I think that that's sort of something that I'm always like very on the lookout for, because I think that tendency among the elites is getting more and more extreme as they rise economically further and further above their fellow Americans in the middle classes and the working classes. What do you
I
think
think
of all
that
that?
would go a long way to explaining Trump's victory in 2016. Hillary's famous comment about the deplorables.
Totally.
Well, those people are not idiots. They know what they're
Yeah.
being insulted. And, if you call them racist, and they're not racist, most of them are not. We know from, many markers at polls over the decades, that conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. I mean, we've all shifted, so that if you come out with this, you're all a bunch of racists, they're just going to say, fuck you. And then Trump comes along and says, I will say it for you because I can't be canceled. So, that's fake news. And, it's the woke libtards trying to own you. And there's, millions of people listen to that and go, yeah, that's right. So more generally, though, let's say, just take that example of, Joe Rogan having Robert Malone on his show, or Brett Weinstein and Heather Hayne. And I know them. I know all these people. And I thought it's perfectly okay. I mean, Joe Rogan this is not 60 Minutes. He's not there to have a team of people prepping him with 100 questions to fire at Brett. He's just bullshitting with people, just talking, and he's really good at that. That's what his show is. Yeah. If you're tuning in to get, some deep journalistic dive into a topic, that's the wrong show, right? And but I watched that episode with Robert Malone and the one with Brett, and I thought, okay, this is really interesting. What is the explanation for that? So I had to go look it up elsewhere, which is fine. I think Robert Malone was mostly wrong, but nevertheless, I should be able to hear that. Why does Spotify or Neil Young have to tell me what I can't or cannot listen to? So there, I like your Vox Populi in that sense. It is kind of a libertarian position, although what about kind of conflicting issues like people should not be free to drive on either side of the road they want? We need, really strict top-down laws to, protect people's freedom by restricting their freedom. You're not free to do anything you want, and that's good.
I mean, what percentage of Americans do you think would vote against a rule that said you can only drive on one side of the road so that we don't kill each other? Probably very few, don't you think?
Yes. Maybe that's a too simple of an example.
So that's evidence for my side.
Well, the mask thing, again, I totally understand it. It's like, who wants to wear masks? And I should be free to do so if I want or not. And people still are. I mean, we're in California here. There's no mask mandates anymore. And I see people driving around Santa Barbara here by themselves in their car with a mask on. It's like, you can't give it to yourself, right? It's just crazy. But if they want to do it, I don't care. It's none of my business. But forcing people, the mandate part, I think we need to separate those. Are vaccines good? Yes. Should we mandate that everyone get them? That's a debatable point.
But I think even like what happened to you with your column is very much about populism and the power of the masses versus the power of the elites. Like the position that you were laying out. I don't know. Have you discussed this? Maybe do you want to, summarize what happened for your listeners, or are they very? Well, no. I was going to say, do you want to? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you want to summarize what happened? Have you talked about it on the show already?
Not much, actually. I haven't made a big deal about it. You're talking about my Scientific American column that I had for 214 straight months.
Yeah, because that's exactly what my book is about, is what happened to you there. Yes. And so I would love for you to sort of, lay it out and we can discuss what happened there, because it's so salient and relevant to all of this.
Yeah. So, they've gone woke over there. It's just younger people coming in, and they're highly educated, elite universities and so on. And, the sense I got, although they never said, you're canceled because you're not woke enough, Shermer. I mean, no one said that. But it seemed pretty evident that when they said it's time for a change, what they meant is we're going in this direction toward this, kind of progressive, whatever terms you want to, woke is kind of a pejorative now. So, but we know what that means. Just say progressive woke ideology, in which everything is going to be cast as race and gender. And to me, that was sacrificing the science. So I had, a couple examples I used in my last couple of columns, which I was just talking about some, ways of knowing about understanding, some particular thing. I used child molestation theory through Carol Tavris, who said, well, the popular theory at the time, for a long time, was that adults who abused their children were themselves abused as children. It's like, okay, that's one hypothesis, but is it true? And there's just as many counterexamples of people who were abused that didn't grow up to abuse their children, or people who were not abused as children who became abusive, right? So you have that 2x2 cell, and so I outlined all that, and they said, no, you can't do this because this is dismissing the pain that people have gone through who have been abused. And it's like, this has nothing to do with somebody's pain. We're looking for the cause. What's the cause of this problem, right? And same thing with another column. And I wrote all about this in my Substack column. But to your book and your point, yes, I think that's exactly what happened at Scientific American. What you're talking about happened at the New York Times and particularly the Los Angeles Times. Here, I'll give you my reading habits. Here's today's paper, Wall Street Journal. This is Saturday's paper, actually, Wall Street Journal. I also read, just to counter that, the New York Times, right? I just canceled my subscription to the Los Angeles Times, which I've had since the 80s, because I like the sports page especially. But they've gone so woke. I mean, in the light of in the heels of George Floyd, they just basically came right out and said, we are changing our policy. We are going full on. They didn't say woke left, progressive, but that's what they did. That's what they said they were going to do, and they have, right? So every day there's op-eds about the kind of racism in Southern California and Los Angeles. Here's one from yesterday's paper called "Why an Algorithm Can Never Truly Be Fair." So this op-ed is about how algorithms discriminate against Blacks, Asians, and Latino inmates, for example. And then she gives many examples of this. And then one of them, let me just read you this, because this gets right to your book. Let's see, the tension over algorithms versus other means of making decisions crops up in human decisions. Universities might be able to admit classes with higher academic credentials if they didn't also value diverse student bodies. Equity is prioritized over performance. On the other hand, police departments often concentrate patrols in high crime areas at the expense of over-policing communities of color. Performance is prioritized over equity. Well, this gets to, you write about this in the history of journalism, that covering crime in these poor neighborhoods was the beat. That was the kind of the origin of widespread journalism. And if I'm following this op-ed correctly, what she's basically saying is it's unfair to target these communities of color with more and more police. But that's where the crime is. So that's where they're supposed to go. That's their job. And you should be covering that in the paper. But they have basically, in a number of these kind of self-flagellating editorials by the editorial staff at the LA Times, they've just said, we made a mistake in covering like the Watts riots back in the 60s. That was totally racist of us to give so much coverage to that. Like, no, that's literally your job. And they're saying that's not our job anymore. We're not gonna do that. They want to, in other words, they want to select equity over performance. Well, what does that mean? I mean, you just pull the police out of these high crime areas, and then what? Then the crime goes up, right? I mean, and then you're not going to cover it so that we don't know. I mean, that don't people want to know? And this is to your thesis. Yes, people want to know what's going on in their neighborhoods. That's what news media is about.
It's also just like the total erasure of the victims of those crimes, because white liberals are embarrassed to read about crimes committed by people of color. And so they erase the 250 Black children who were shot in Philadelphia. More Black children were shot in Philly in 2021 than got COVID and died of COVID, okay?
Really?
Like, that's what we're talking about here. And they erase those children because it embarrasses them as white liberals to talk about crime in communities of color. And if that's exactly what they did to you with that molestation argument. How can you stop people from molesting children if you don't know why they do it, right? Like, obviously, you need to have the right cause so you can stop it, right? That's what you were pointing out in that column. You were saying, look, they thought the cause was parents who had been molested. It turns out that's not true. It's like, great, we actually really need to know that. Every single person who was molested as a child really needs to know that so we can move on from the wrong cause and find the right cause and then stop it. But your white liberal editor decided she or he needed to protect their readers from hearing about something because it embarrassed her or because it minimizes the pain. Like, that's crazy. And they do this over and over and over again. The defund the police movement was exactly the same thing. Like, we know that this violent crime is concentrated in poor Black, Latino communities. We know that they need police in order to protect them. The victims of all of these crimes are poor people of color. We also know that we need police reform. Yes, it is true. The police insult Black people more. They pull them over more. They lay hands on them more. They put them in handcuffs more. It turns out actually they don't shoot them more. They shoot poor people more than they shoot rich people. But once you control for economics, they don't shoot poor Black people more than poor white people. So we know that we have these two needs, right? We need police reform, we need better policing, and we need police who are going to show up in these communities and protect these victims of violent crime. And we know also that nobody's going to do this if the press isn't telling politicians, look, this blood is on your hands. Like, these children are being shot in their beds. George Floyd's niece, who marched for justice for her uncle's murder, was shot in her bed. I mean, thank God she survived. But like, nobody has ever heard her name. Nobody ever says her name because the media, the liberal media, is created by and for rich whites who already live in totally protected, extremely expensive neighborhoods. And it embarrasses them to hear about this crime because it reminds them of their own economic privilege. And so they would rather sentence these communities to live with the crime than talk about it. And instead they push nonsense like defund the police because it makes them feel good about themselves, even though 81% of Black Americans oppose the defund the police movement. And it's completely on the media. It looks like it's a story about race, but actually it is a story about class, about how the media got rich, how journalists and the intelligentsia and the people who are supposed to be telling the great American story, the first draft of history, got rich, and they got so far above middle and working class Americans that they now produce all the news just for each other. And that means that you're going to get this like woke academic nonsense about race and gender on every single page, even when it means more children are going to be molested because we've made a taboo. We're not allowing, Shermer to write about this. And so we create a taboo on saying which are the causes that are the wrong causes. And you just see this again and again and again, like defund the police. That's what you came up with. But that's all you could read about in the New York Times throughout the entire summer of 2020, the fall of 2020 and into the election. Anything that doesn't fit that narrative that protects the egos and the quote unquote virtues of the elites, you're not going to read about. And I think that move, what I was talking about before, like taking something that's a class marker, a marker of your class privilege, that you don't need the police because you're already so rich. You live in a neighborhood that no working class person, no poor person would ever dream of walking into. And then clothing that as virtue, as a sign of how much more virtuous you are than anybody on the other side of the political spectrum. That is liberalism today. And it's pretty shocking. I can tell I'm worked up about it. So that's what my book is about, how that happened and why.
How do you really feel about you? Don't mince words with us here. Yes, indeed. And you wrote about Tony Timpa, the white guy who basically had the same experience as George Floyd. And you can watch that video online. It's just as disturbing. And yet that didn't get any play. Why not? Is that also didn't fit the narrative?
Right. So like crime, crime is a story of, not everybody. Of course, there's crime. All people commit crimes. All races commit crimes. But by and large, right now in America today, the majority of crime is, by people of color against other people of color, which doesn't mean it's not our responsibility. It is our responsibility 100%. I believe that systemic racism, of course, played a role in creating this situation. But we have to be able to solve this. We have to figure out how this happened, why this happened, and to prevent it. But that doesn't fit the narrative. So the narrative right now is very much one that comes right out of academia. I'm sure, your listeners who like have that background or who have heard you talk about this, they will instantly recognize it. But it's that critical theory model that's, based on, I would say, a misinterpretation of Marxism, but, that sort of Marxist binary between, it started with Hegel, right? The difference between the oppressor and the oppressed, the view that the most important thing between any two humans is not, virtue, is not right versus wrong, but is who has the power and who doesn't. And what we've done in America today is we've taken that question of who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, and we've superimposed a racial binary onto that to where people of color are viewed as inherently less powerful, inherently having no agency, and being operated upon by powerful whites, by the white supremacy, for example, and that's all you need to know, right? So the white people are inherently evil, inherently, marred by their whiteness, and people of color are inherently virtuous because of their victim status. That's kind of that you use that explains everything. Explains, why Jussie Smollett, right, who invented a crime that didn't happen, right? He was lionized by the liberal media because he blamed Trump voters, white people, for attacking him, a person of color, whereas they won't talk about the actual crime that's running rampant in liberal cities because it doesn't fit into that binary, right? The aggressors, the criminals, are the wrong race, right? So they literally, I think they really can't see it. I don't think that they're evil. I think that they're, so in this kind of myopia that they can't see outside of it. And it just explains everything. It explains, why they tried to turn Kyle Rittenhouse into a white supremacist and, imply that he had gone to the Black Lives Matter rally to shoot Black people, because that is what they, it's like the sort of inverse, the negative fantasy of how they see the world. Like everything, they interpret it through that lens. Explains why there's no coverage of crime. It explains why they hated Trump. It explains so much. Like that sort of master-slave dialectic is how, Hegel initially thought of it, and it sort of seeped down into the mainstream through the media and colors literally like everything in that binary.
How do you explain?
But here's something I'm really curious what you think about.
Okay.
The only people who seem or the people who seem best able to resist this are religious people. And I think that's really important. There's, the liberals are really falling prey to this.
How do you know that they're not just...
So I know this. I know this so anecdotally from speaking to professors and teachers who often, obviously this is, anecdotal is not the same as data, but I'll get to that in a second. But they often will tell you, like in their classrooms, that there's immense pressure to sort of adhere to this woke paradigm, and that the students who are the only students who are able to say, actually, I don't really see things that way, and that's okay, are the religious ones. But there was recently a study that came out that found that, it's slightly a slightly different topic, but found that working class kids in college who were really the only ones who were really able to succeed were ones that came from a religious background. I'm sort of very anti-college because I feel like it's really sort of selling out the working class by giving this false impression that, if you don't have a college degree, if you're not in a knowledge industry job, you're worthless. And that meritocracy, I feel like, is really, really problematic in America and really feeds into the disastrous income inequality we see. But both the anecdotal data and this sort of more systemic study that found that they just had more reserves of self-esteem and like a way to place themselves within this more foreign context, that's very this elite context tends to be very antagonistic towards conservative values, working class values, religious values. They were the ones who were able to, finish and get that degree, as opposed to a lot of others who dropped out. And I think that's I think that's really interesting, like because I don't see in liberalism, like to me, all I see is liberals falling prey to wokeness, which is an illiberal and I think godless and very bad worldview, right? It's gross. I'm sure the CL study that found that white liberals, talk down to people of color in a way that white conservatives don't. And it just seems to me like there's very little in liberal culture that seems like it's able to resist this. In practice, like in theory, I could say, well, surely like believing in free speech and debate and blah, 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 like all that stuff is supposed to be able to withstand a racial binary, a moral binary based on race that replaces morality with power. But in practice, it seems to me like what we're seeing right now is that liberalism is not able to stand up to it, but religion, interestingly, is. So I'm very curious what you think about that.
I guess you're asking because I'm an atheist, but first let me just hit a couple points you made there on what it's called, the
Yes.
bigotry of low expectations. This, talking down to people of color, or
Yeah.
kind of implying that you can't do it without us white elites who have the power.
Mm-hmm.
And before we give you the power, we're going to help you pull yourself up because you don't have any bootstraps. We're going to give you the boots and the straps because you can't do it without us. Yes, I think that's
Yeah.
a despicable position. Maybe they just can't help it if you're a highly educated elite. I mean, it kind of goes within the job description. We're better than you. That's what it means, I guess, to be an elite. And so that's an
Totally.
unfortunate byproduct of that. Right.
Totally.
The systemic racism. So I was going to ask you that. Let me come back to that for a second. Let me just comment on religion. I think what that's probably tapping is that the belief that there are objective moral values that really are true. They
Mm-hmm.
can be discovered by interacting with other people. In the same way that we discover that, this is the analogy I use, that planetary orbits are elliptical, and Kepler was doing the right calculations. He could hardly have discovered anything else, or that DNA is a double helix. It doesn't matter what your politics are. That's the way it is. And there's certain moral truths that certain things are right and wrong. Most of the time, most places, for most people, this is it. And so I think religious people have that belief. I happen to have that belief as well. This kind of universal realism, as it's called, and not just me, but Sam Harris, Steve Pinker, a few others who say, "Hang on, this moral relativism has gone too far." There are certain, you can take kind of the utilitarian argument that only so far, that you sacrifice the five to sacrifice the one to save the five on the footbridge trolley problem. Well, you wouldn't want to live in a world where a doctor would just willy nilly sacrifice one patient waiting in the waiting room to save the five patients in the ORs because they have rights, and the rights trump the utilitarian argument of the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, where do those rights come from? Well, I end up making an argument for natural law that that they're inherent in human nature. That there's nothing special about the piece of land I'm standing on. Copernican principle. I'm not special. There's no reason that I should expect you to treat me in a way that I shouldn't also treat you. Kind of the golden rule. And these are basic principles that religions discovered thousands of years ago. Just take Judaism. I mean, that's Maimonides. Just love thy neighbor as thyself. All the rest is commentary. That's basic game theory. Evolutionary ethics and game theory explains why that is the case, why that works. So to me, you can discover that by studying the science of morality. And religious people are doing the same thing, but they just have a different source. And religions have been around for, just take Judaism, for thousands of years. So they've had plenty of time to run the experiments and say, no, this works better than that. There's a reason we have these rules instead of those rules. So, and along comes the, elite liberal left that says, no, 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 it's all cultural relativism. That who am I to tell you what's right and wrong? It's none of my business. And, so there, we can kind of fine tune that if you want. It's something like the hijab. It's none of my business what women wear. I shouldn't have, I shouldn't tell you what you should wear. You can do whatever you want. Okay, but what if you're in a culture where you didn't actually choose that? You're just born and raised that way, and at some point, your father or your brothers or your husband says you have to wear the hijab. You have no choice, and they have their reasons or whatever. It seems to me that's wrong because it violates a deeper principle of bodily autonomy and choice and freedom to control your own decisions like that, and that somebody making you do something like that's a different kind of thing. So, foreign policy, imposing American Western values on other cultures. Okay, maybe that's not always the right thing to do, but we're not if we're not talking about just clothing options, but choices and whether people are free to make them or not. So I think what's probably being tapped there with conservatives or conservative Christians, or it's hard to say, maybe disentangle conservative and Christian, but they go hand in hand because of that deeper belief. There are objective moral values. There is a right and wrong. And so when you say there is no right and wrong, that's where the departure happens there. And I think that's tapping a deeper problem there. There was something else. Yep.
So, but wouldn't that put conservatives and religious people specifically, okay, like what percentage of Americans do you think are in your camp who are like non-religious, non-conservative, but believe in these objective principles? Like many fewer than are either in the liberal
Way
postmodernist,
fewer.
there's no difference between
Yes,
right and wrong
yes,
camp, or in the conservative religious. But so doesn't that mean that you have more in common with religious
yes,
people right now
yes,
than with other woke
yes. There's
liberals?
some irony there, isn't there? Yes. Yes, I think for the most part, most conservatives and Christians that I deal with are very respectful to me. I mean, way more respectful and polite than
Right.
progressives who just hate me. And it's like, even though I tick all the boxes, I'm pro-choice, free speech, I want some more gun controls, climate science is real. I tick all the boxes that they should like. But hang on now, you believe this one little thing over here, so you're out. Whereas conservatives, or someone takes like Ben Shapiro, he's very religious, and we had an hour-long thoughtful conversation on his Sunday special show, and he respects me and I respect him, and even though I'm an atheist and he's not, and so on, and that's how I'm mostly treated. I mean, I debunk creationists, and they're unfailingly polite to me. They take me out to dinner after I debunk them, and we have drinks together, and they subscribe to my magazine, and it's like, wow, okay. That tells you something. Again, I think maybe it's those
That's
conservative or religious
awesome.
values that you treat people with certain respect that the liberals have seemed to have lost.
So what you're saying is I mean, you are actually saying that at some level the religious people are on the kind of the right side of history in a way because you have more in common with them, and they are holding the line on very important issues, be it for the same reasons you or
Hmm.
not, in a way that the liberal side no longer
In
is.
some cases, although they were slow to come around with, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, the religious polling shows that they were always lagging a few years behind, and those were liberal causes for other reasons. This is pre-progressive,
Yeah. Yeah, that's
say
true. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
1950s,
Yeah,
1960s.
that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
So it depends on on the particular case. At least they come around, though. I mean, that's good. The same-sex marriage thing happened incredibly fast. Some from 2011 when both Obama and Hillary
Totally.
said they were against same-sex marriage, and then 2015 Supreme Court decision, and now it's
Totally.
not even on the platform of people discussing it. It's like it's a done issue.
Yeah.
So, okay, I was going to ask you about something else. Oh, okay, let's go back to the racism thing. All right, so when someone like you or me or Pink or whoever says, "Look, the polls all show, even whites in the Midwest are less racist than they used to be," again, what's your position on interracial marriage? People would go, "What? What are you talking about? Who cares? I mean, of course it's okay." Whereas, before 1967 and that Supreme Court decision, majority of Americans were against interracial marriage. What happened? Well, okay, so
Yep.
things have changed. So now, what is your response to the counter to that, which is we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about systemic racism. It's built into the law, the real estate system. It's in the prison system. It's everywhere.
So I would say from my point of view, from what I can tell, I could be wrong about this, but from my understanding of the data that I've tried really hard to objectively look at, and which did change my mind because I used to be very woke, it seems to me that there are four remaining areas where the state is involved or implicated in a disparity between white and Black Americans. And they're very important issues, but they are no longer issues that have a partisan divide. I would say the four issues are these: police brutality, as I mentioned before. I think the data does show that two times as many Black Americans have been insulted by the police. Obviously, we all know the data about how they're pulled over more by police, a disparity that evaporates at night, meaning that it really is tied to who a police officer is seeing in the driver's seat. They lay hands on Black Americans more. They throw them up against cars more. Some of this perhaps is the result of policing Black people more because of where crime is, but some of it isn't. And so there are bad apples in the police, and I do think we're starting to see a shift in the culture to where police officers are now willing to call out each other. and that's really positive. And we're seeing Republicans very invested in this issue as well. The last police reform bill that was put forward by a Republican, Senator Tim Scott, a Black Republican, and it was filibustered by the Democrats, who then, 3 months later turned around and called the filibuster a relic of white supremacy. So the irony should not be lost on anybody that this is politics and deeply cynical. So that's one area, is police brutality. The second area is mass incarceration. I think a lot of those disparities show that judges give this different sentences based on people's race. And I think that, to me, it seems like that data is solid. The third area I would say is education. I don't believe that Black Americans have equal access to education. In New York City, our public schools are more segregated than Alabama's. Which is unbelievable when you consider the amount of sort of righteous, morality that people in New York have about issues like Black Lives Matter, but they would never let their children go to school with poor Black kids. And then the fourth is intergenerational poverty in 20 to 30% of Americans descended from slavery. So to me, the way I see it is, I don't believe that we have, I think even the word systemic racism is too broad. I don't believe America's a white supremacist state. I think that's a canard. We don't have a problem with whiteness. There are many minorities that we treat as complete equals who are not white. Jews, Asian Americans Asians out earn everybody. A lot of immigrants, even from African countries, Hispanics increasingly, LGBTQ people, Muslims, all of these minorities, we don't have a problem treating them equal. It is my view that we continue to guarantee Americans descended from slaves specifically equality before the law in the two areas that I mentioned, and their children a fair shot at the American dream. So that's kind of my view, which I hope is deeply rooted in data and the data that I've reviewed. But I'm obviously open to being wrong, and I know that a lot of my woke friends think that it is in the law, it's baked into the law, it's baked into American institutions, and then a lot of my conservative friends say no. There's all of these issues can be explained through other factors than racism, through economics and what have you. I will say that the idea that America's institutions are so deeply implicated in racism that they must all be sort of razed to the ground and rebuilt from the bottom up. So that is a question that the Pew Research Center posed to Democrats across the board. And they found that only progressives, which is the whitest and the richest and the most highly educated of all of the liberal, all of the Democratic subgroups, they were the only ones who believed this by over 90%, meaning this is not a view that's held by the majority of Black Americans, 2/3 of whom call themselves either moderate or conservative. And it's a very patriotic community as well. So again, that sort of the view that is held by white progressives is very alien within the Black community and very alien within, other minority communities. And I think that it's that again is a question of class. Like at some point you get so rich that you start to believe this nonsense coming out of the academy. So, I think my view is sort of, it's not liberal enough to satisfy the liberals, and it's probably too liberal to satisfy the conservatives. But I hope that it's based on the data as far as I could understand it.
No, I like all that. It reminds me of the use of the word Latinx Latinx. A word that Latinos and Latinas themselves wouldn't use or don't use or claim that they don't use. Or
Right. So only 3% of Hispanics call themselves Latinx. The majority of them use the word Hispanic. Some of them say Latino. But what I like to say is it's like, in England, my dad's British, and in England, you can tell by someone's accent to within 20, 30 miles where they were born. And you can guess with 90%, assurance, like how much money their father made. Like it's built into the accent, and people work really hard to overcome that. In America, we don't have accents. We have words like Latinx, like words that are supposed to signify the class you belong to, the education you received, the fancy university that you attended, right? It's a marker of class more than it is of anything else. But that's been dressed up as virtue by progressives to hide, the degree to which they are so much richer than the middle and working class Americans that they used to represent.
I see. So that's your populist argument. That makes sense. Yeah. Again, it's like the Native Americans who were not offended by the name Washington Redskins football team, but the elite liberals were offended by it, or they were offended in proxy for the Native Americans. They said, you should be offended by this, so we're going to be offended for you. But I don't care what they call their football
Right.
team. Yes, you do. Yeah. So let's go through these because
Exactly.
So at least you've pinpointed 4 areas so we can target where we can make further moral progress, like police brutality. Now, I think someone like Heather McDonald would say that the reason there's more hands-on or interactions, negative interactions between police and people of color is because there's more interactions in total. There's just more contact as opposed to patrolling in rich white neighborhoods, which they don't need to bother to do. So just statistically speaking, there's going to be a higher number. Do you know if they controlled for that, controlled for the amount of interactions, and then the rate of putting your hands on or slamming them against cars is still higher?
I do believe that they did. The study came out of Harvard, and it was by a very liberal. A lot of these studies are done by people who expect to find, one thing and then find another thing. I think I've looked at Heather McDonald's work. I really respect where she's coming from. I really hope she's right, but I don't see how that would impact pulling people over for driving and why that disparity would disappear at night if it wasn't based on the police's ability to see the race of the driver. And also the one that I know that this is maybe ironic, but the one that offends me the most is the insulting. I'm Jewish, and when I'm trying to distinguish between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, this sounds like a tangent, but it's not, I promise. The thing that I tell people is the thing that made anti-Semitism so terrible was that for thousands of years, a Jewish person would be attacked by their neighbors and they would call the police and the police would show up and rape their wife. Like that was sort of it was that there was no state power to defend them. The state power participated in the pogroms. There was no one to protect you. You were not really a full citizen. You didn't have citizenship. You didn't have citizenship rights. You weren't really a part of that nation state. And when you would reach out for help from the people who are supposed to defend you, they would come and join in. They would participate. They would, slash your kids. And I think that the point I usually make is that will never be true of Israel. Like they will never be in that situation of needing to call for help and having the person who's supposed to protect you join in on the violence. They have the 17th most powerful army in the world. And so to me, anti-Zionism will always just be something else. It's a political statement. It's not an act of bigotry, although it can be informed by bigotry. A lot of anti-Zionists are bigots, but a lot of them hate Jews as well. But it will never have that same thing that we had for generations. To me, what I think happens in the Black community based on this data a lot and based on, obviously, talking to people, understanding what it's like is people will reach out to the police and be insulted by the cops that they reached out to for help. And knowing that subconsciously that I think white people walk around in America, if something bad happens, your instinct is to run to the police and know that they will see you as in need of protection. And knowing that you're 2 times as likely to be insulted by the cops if you reach out to them, if you need them, that keeps me up at night. And I know that it's not, being insulted is not as bad as being thrown up against a car, but I can imagine a situation in which Heather McDonald is right that, if you have more interactions, you're going to have more interactions that turn violent, right? For whatever reason, for a combination of escalation on both sides, let's say, perhaps. I could see that being a factor. I could see that being a thing that maybe lowers the disparity's moral import. But I can't get past the insulting, and I can't get past that. And I think probably because I'm informed by my people's history, but I think that is I just don't see how anything could justify that. And I think that there are ways, if we were just talking about that, we could think of ways to solve it, to address it. But instead we talk about there being a genocide against Black men, which just isn't the case. For political gains, the liberals and the progressives have escalated the nature of the problem to where it's unsolvable. I mean, they say that it's baked into the DNA of America. I don't believe any of that. That the police is started as slavery. No, I don't believe any of that. I think that's all nonsense. But what they did there was they escalated the problem to their own political advancement and advantage to where it's so systemic. I mean, you can't change systems, right? It's so baked into what America is, the nature of the nation, that you can't solve it. And that really bothers me a lot,
Yeah,
too.
that's the John McWhorter's analogy. He's not the first one to make that it's like a religion. And that's the original sin. You're born in sin. You cannot be forgiven. There's nothing you can do to atone for it, except in case of religion, you accept Jesus as your
Right. So
savior.
I think it's yeah, I find it actually, I really respect him, but I find it quite elitist when he says that. Like, as a religious person, I can tell you that is not what religion feels like. As a person who's religious, who was woke, I can tell you that
That's funny.
they feel very differently from being inside of them. And I think that there is this penchant on behalf of like a lot of intellectuals who are anti-woke to be like, this is the kind of thing you might expect from like, lame people who believe in God,
Okay,
right? Like not
I
from
see. I see.
intellectuals. And I think there's like a little bit of
That is a little
elitism there.
that's interesting. So, how then do you respond to someone like Shelby Steele, who I had on the podcast, who says, "Well, blacks should do what the Jews did. Look at the history of Judaism and the history of anti-Semitism going back thousands of years. You can't argue that anyone's been more oppressed and prejudiced against than the Jews, and they show up in America. They're discriminated against. They can't go to colleges and universities. They can't join country clubs." And so on, and yet they just created their own schools. They published their own books, created their own networks of jobs and industries, and they just did it. So that's why can't blacks do that?
So I would quote Shelby Steele back to Shelby Steele, who I truly, truly admire. I certainly agree with him that, white liberals have made that more difficult for Black Americans because of that sort of treating them as in need of liberal beneficence, right? Like white liberals get their rocks off by like helping, people of color, and that there has been this imposed view of, a lack of agency. I would quote Shelby Steele back to himself. I'm very convinced by that. He had this amazing movie, What Killed Michael Brown, where he said that the America's original sin was not slavery; it was the use of race as a means to power. And I think that's so smart and so deep. And you definitely still see white liberals engaged in that, in currying power, using Black Americans as a crucible for their own political and economic gains. And it's disgusting, and we should all call it out. So I think definitely there's, problems there. I also think that look, legacy of redlining, okay? Ghettos, right? Like there are physical realities on the ground that Jews never had to overcome in this country for sure. And I just think that there's a cruelty in expecting that. And again, it's sort of I don't know. To me, it's you can't meritocracy your way out of this problem because it's so complex, like you said. And there are so many factors contributing to it. Like, for example, the lack of vocational schools, just the erasure, the decimation of vocational training, the decimation of unions, like so many things that made life for working class Americans across the board harder. And then were compounded by historic legacies that, America is no longer white supremacy, but we do still have these legacies. I mean, the way that a lot of Black Americans, the situation that they live in is we would never allow that for our own children. And so I think without descending into the kind of that sort of gross moralizing of liberals, I do think that as a nation, we still do have responsibility and are still implicated in a lot of this. I think the public schools are a really good example. Like in New York City, we have these 3 specialized public high schools. I mean, just looking at them, like the level of facilities that they offer the children who are the children of the brightest and the smartest and the most talented versus the ones, in the inner cities. I mean, to me, that's just disgusting. Like the idea that the public is funding that disparity. And most of the kids, I think at this point in the specialized school are actually the children of immigrants. And that's wonderful. I'm not saying it's racism that allowed for that, but like there's something about that just screams out for correction. How can you allow the public to fund that disparity and perpetuate that disparity? And it's not driven by race. Like everybody wants there to be more Black kids in the specialized schools, but nobody is putting forward a way to get them there. And also it begs the question, what about everybody else? It truly does. Like, I want the elites to be more diverse. I truly do. But that's all the liberal elites want, is like to look around themselves in their elite, in first class, right? And see Black people there. And like, of course, I want to see Black people in first class, but what about everybody else? And I think that there's nobody on either side is really asking that question. I sort of a little bit evaded your question,
Oh, no,
but
it's all right.
I hope there's
No, there's
enough
a lot
there.
there. So the public school situation in New York City, is it driven by zip code? You can only send your kid to the school that's in your zip code?
No, there's a test. There's a test, and the children of Chinese immigrants, they get off that boat and they start studying for that test, and they have a network, and it's wonderful. It's amazing. I mean, it's truly a marvel to witness. I really don't think that the test itself is racist, that anyone making these decisions is racist. But I really think that in many ways we've allowed a meritocratic view to replace justice. Because, and of course it makes sense. Yes, like, there is a view of justice that says, look, the most talented and the smartest should be able to go as far as their talents take them. Like there's something that feels like correct and right about that nobody should be limited in how far they can go based on their talents. Like I totally, I can see that. I could see how, the opposite of that is the Soviet Union, right? Which is obviously like deeply, deeply unjust and immoral and awful and bad and leads straight to starvation. Like I get all of that. But at the same time, if you don't have a moral view that cares about everybody, you're only going to have all of the benefits and all of the political power concentrated among the smartest and the most talented. And that's why I say in my book title that, this wokeness is undermining democracy, because it's oligarchic. We're headed towards, if not already in an oligarchy, because it starts with saying, look, let's pluck every smart kid out of the ghetto and make sure they get to Harvard. Yes, every smart kid in the ghetto should be in Harvard. Totally want that. But what about everybody else? And increasingly, they don't even believe that, if you're part of the unwashed masses and the deplorables, they don't even believe you should have the right to have your say, to have a vote increasingly. So I think it's dangerous as well as immoral.
A couple things there. The use of tests like the SAT and the ACT, University of California last year dropped it. Just last week, the California State University system also dropped it in the name of equity, that that the people of color are scoring lower on these tests, and if we use that as one of our measures, we're going to get fewer of them, and we're elevating diversity over performance, to use that example again. What's wrong with that? They're free to choose whatever criteria they want, but I guess the counter argument to that then is that those tests used to pluck poor people of color out of these crappy classrooms where they could really show that they're smart and should go to one of these elite schools, and that's the way to rescue them. That's kind of the two ends of that debate.
Yeah, I mean, were we like so hampered like 30, 40, 50 years ago when, the system was like less meritocratic in that sense? We were more hampered by like racial inequality for sure. Like, you couldn't, the number of Black doctors, scientists, whatever, obviously that was really problematic. But it used to be, they didn't have these tests that were like so geared towards measuring a certain kind of IQ, a certain kind of intelligence, that I don't know, do you really need all of those things like to become a dentist? Do you really need, but to become a dentist today, you have to study physics. And it's like, I mean, dentistry is essentially like, I mean, is it really,
Yeah.
I mean, do you have to know physics? No, a lot of that is just gatekeeping, because we don't want there to be too many dentists, because we want dentists to be rich. So I think, that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is I would have a lot less of a problem with this kind of sorting if it wasn't the only way to the American dream. I mean, right now, the only way to the American dream is to be really smart, really rich, or really good looking. And I have a real problem with that. Like if we were living in the 1970s where there was like enormous wage growth for the working class, where like very little separated the working class from the middle class and even from the rich, like it was just, I would have a lot less problem with saying, look, we're going to pick the smartest two kids from each class and send them to Harvard, so it'll be like a perfect reflection of America, and it will be the smartest kids, and everybody else will stay home and become a mechanic and still be able to make $150,000 a year and, have a good life, own their home, send their kids to college if they want, have a pool in the back, like whatever it is. I think it's the I would have a lot less of a problem with it if it wasn't the only pathway up. And I have a real problem with saying, like, I mean, God is very stingy with his gifts. Like, like, why would we allow that to define who gets to have a good job? It's so Calvinist, like,
that's funny.
So I object to that.
God's making those decisions. I don't know. I think God, wound the whole system up at the beginning. Well, I'm an atheist, so I don't even think that happened. But, then just let the chips fall where they may. We have free will. Don't forget, we have free will. That's why we have to be held accountable for these things.
We do.
Okay, that's interesting. You made this point about better looking people. It's true. I mean, studies since I was in college have shown that, attractive people make more money, get better jobs, marry up to, better family environments and in economic class and just have more things done for them. Just doors open up. You can just see it with your own eyes. You can't miss it. But that doesn't have the same, I guess, valence or emotional salience that race and more broadly gender has, I think. I mean, there's occasionally discussions of that, but the sense is like, well, yeah, it's a genetic lottery. Some people are just better looking than others. It's just the way it goes. And we're just going to live with that, right? But is that your sense as well? It's treated differently than race.
Yeah, totally. But come on, I mean, it's so true. It's like people who are beautiful, like they for sure are in their own category, and I agree with you. I've seen those studies as well, and I think someone like AOC, for example, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's so smart and so beautiful and so charismatic. Like, she is proof that the American dream really does work. She's sort of like, if she were a Republican, she would be out there being like, look, I'm proof that this system works. You can come from this working class background and like through this, your own talents, you can rise up, and like, but by the time you're 30, make $200,000 a year and drive a Tesla or whatever, right? I agree with you. It is interesting that we never do talk about that. I think it's because people really like looking at beautiful people. And so they're just, there's this sort of like, meh, what are you going to do?
Yes. Well, what you're going to do is emphasize the traits that you have that are better. And because it's not just looks, intelligence matters or cleverness or wittiness, humor, a warm personality, just as a guy, what do women want? Well, of course they like tall, good looking guys. I mean, women want men that are at least their height or more. We know that from many studies. And so on. So, well, I'm 5'8", and I wish I was 5'11". I know I would have done better, when I was in high school than I did. But then I discovered that women also like it when you have a sense of humor. So I thought, well, I'm going to develop my sense of humor. And then some girl said, hey, I heard him say, that Shermer guy is pretty smart. I'm like, ooh, they like smart. Okay, I'll work on that. So I can't do anything about my height, right? And so I'll work on the things that I do have. And and maybe that's a metaphor for these other characteristics that you can't control. Well, I'm just going to do something else that I can control, something like that.
I do also think that like subconsciously, okay, this is not like I don't have any data to back this up, but I think subconsciously a lot of people's politics is driven by who they feel preemptively rejected by. Like I think the fear of rejection is really powerful, and if you feel like a certain politician or a certain person or a certain pundit or like would reject you, that can fuel a lot of like emotional, a lot of emotional gusto behind your disapproval of that person is something I've noticed.
I'll tell you a funny story. I caught myself in one of these examples where I was coming out of a mall parking lot in Pasadena, and the person in front of me, I could see it was a woman, but she could not get the credit card to work for the gate for the parking charge. And I was in a hurry, so I was getting angrier and angrier, and I'm like, I'm going to go up and give this idiot a piece of my mind. I walk up there, and this is one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. And within like a nanosecond, it's like, is there anything I could do? Please let me pay for your parking. And I was like, oh my God, Shermer, are you that bad? It's like, yeah, I'm a guy.
That's hilarious.
And I think that,
it's
and we know
sad.
from studies of
I'm sure there's
political candidates, the taller candidates are more likely to win, better looking candidates are more likely to win.
Yeah.
It's like, that doesn't seem fair, but that's just the way it is. Okay, I thought of something else I was going to come back at. Oh, yes. So again, channeling that kind of Shelby Steele, or just say the right wing or conservative argument. If Asians, when they get off the boat, just put their kids through these training programs, why can't people of color, blacks or Hispanics, do this? And again, the Shelby Steele argument is something like, because they don't have an intact home, they don't have a father and a mother, they don't have a lot of books in the house, and that's the causal vector there. It's an intact, stable family with books and a culture norm that you are going to go to college. It's the only question is which elite college are you going to get into, and you're not even going to think about being a tradesperson. So and this starts at age 3 or 5 or whatever, and that 20 years later you have these disparities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, a society where everybody goes to college, to an elite college, and becomes like some sort of professional, that's not a sustainable society. Like, we need a society where people make things and move things and bring things and cook things, and right. Like, there's if suddenly overnight everyone in America had that mentality, whether or not their child was well suited to that life, like that would not be a sustainable society, right? Like, we need growers, and we need movers, and we need doers, and we need builders, and we need contractors. And so, and we can't be like, I mean, I don't want us to be like Saudi Arabia, where all of that work is done by, slave labor, right? Like, that's the alternative, is to have people crossing the border illegally and doing it for $2 an hour. And I'm against that. So, so that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, like, I think the data does show that there is a correlation between, an intact home and social mobility. I mean, the number one thing you can do if you want your child to be socially mobile is get married before you have them, right? Like, that's I think the data does bear that out. I think the data about reading and about books bears that out. At the same time, I mean, I would say two things. The first is, obviously, like, liberal overreach is one of the big reasons for the breakdown of the Black family, right? The change in welfare laws to where essentially you were penalized for having a man in the house, right? So we bear a certain burden there. Like, we did that, right? So what are we going to do to change it? How are we going to shift it? I totally agree that one of the things we should be pushing is, like, for people to get married. Like, people act like that's a cultural battle, but it's not. It's a totally economic one. I mean, the median income for a Black male head of household who's married is $93,000 a year, which is $60,000 a year more than for a Black head of household who's not married. I mean, I don't know why we're not pushing that. Whatever, correlation, causation, let's try something, right? Like, let's find out which way it goes, right? The median income for a white person who across the board, a white male, is $50,000 a year. So you're telling me that a married Black man is making $40,000 a year more than the average white American? Like, that seems important. That seems relevant. That seems like something you could work with, something you might want to investigate. Instead, we get, like, the LGBTQ, trans agenda, right? And I'm not saying that to, like, say that that's not important, that's not good. I support all of those rights, but that those rights, the pursuit of those rights, has turned into a moral posture that is very much against the nuclear family, in the name of a culture war against conservatives and against religious people, when we know that there is a huge economic burden, economic cost that's being borne by that. Again, we don't know why it is. Some economists say it's because married men work harder. Some economists say it's because the same qualities that make you a good husband make you a good worker. We don't know what it is, but certainly this seems like something worth investigating. So in a way, I sort of agree and disagree with Shelby Steele again, if I may, with somebody he's such a great Rebbe and I really admire him. But I would say, like, there's a lot going on here, and it could both be the case that, the breakdown of the Black family plays a big role in a lot of these issues, and be the case that A, we participated in creating the conditions for that breakdown, and B, that doesn't make it not our problem. Like, it's still our problem. Like, sure, maybe that's it. What are we going to do about that? Let's talk about that. Where do we go from here? What's the conservative take on how to rebuild those families, how to rebuild that society, not in a patronizing way, but just in a, look, let's take a data-driven approach and an approach based on autonomy. What do these people want? These people want the same things you do. They want their children to be, upwardly mobile. They want stable families. They want, there's horrific data about talking about child abuse, that a woman who's cohabiting with a partner who's not the father of her children those children are exponentially more likely to be abused both physically and sexually. It's a national emergency. You know what I mean? Like, but instead of talking about this stuff and saying, there's also a correlation between test scores and abuse. Children who are abused more do much worse in school. This is, of course, playing a role in a community where 70% of children are born out of wedlock. This embarrasses white liberals to talk about this. And so they won't ever bring it up. And they rather just allow those children to be abused because they're embarrassed to talk about it. And I think that that's a really important issue as well.
Well, the explanation is very practical. Two people living in a house can be more economically efficient than one. And if you have kids, then it's expensive. Yeah. I have kids. They're expensive. And, it just helps to have two incomes or help, division of labor, and I've known single moms, and it's like, oh, what a tough job that is. To have a job and caretaking. Yeah. So maybe you have some family, parental, grandparent support. Maybe you don't. How do you pay for the, to what extent the cost of babysitters? Gosh, the last time I checked, it was like $25 an hour. It's like, what a gig. This is great. And they sit over on the couch on their phones with the kids playing off, in the corner.
Totally.
What a job. But, if you're making $20 an hour and you got to pay the babysitter $25 an hour, well, then why bother? Right. So, but if, again, if you're married, well, it's the Johnny Cash line, because you're mine, I toe the line, right? The guys who are married are just less likely to be out causing trouble, hanging around the bar with the guys and going out and, stirring up shit and getting in fights. And you just don't do that when you're married. You just stay home. And that makes for a better, more stable home environment. And a kid that's, harassed or beaten or just has an unstable home, how can they possibly concentrate in school? Okay, here's today's lessons, we're going to do geometry. And their mind is, just completely overwhelmed with anxiety and fear and just thought flooding of the bad home environment. How can they possibly score on those tests? And the solution can't be get rid of the tests. It has to be something else.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there are some things, where you want the person, performing the surgery to be, like,
competent.
You don't want them to have gotten into school because of some sort of,
let me add, I guess the government being in the marriage business or socially engineering married life seems a little intrusive. Although we do have, if you're, I know, I use an example.
Look, we reverse engineered it, right?
That's right. Yes. Did we? Is that, so are you saying that's the effect of affirmative action from the 1960s on?
It was affirmative action and then, rewriting the welfare guidelines to where you would lose your welfare if you had a man in the house, if you were married, if you were in, a stable, the men had to go and hide or not be there. And so in that sense, we incentivized having kids out of wedlock. And obviously, I don't think the government should be involved in like telling people to get married or whatever. But I do think that there could be a cultural push towards that, influencers and so forth, people, And I think it's more the kind of the anti-marriage, stable family rhetoric that's so identified with characters like, people who are the sort of standard bearers of the left, people who themselves are, overwhelmingly married and reaping the economic benefits of being married, right? Like there's something so terrible about it, like them pushing things that they would never accept for their own children on other people. And a course correction on that front. I agree with you. I don't think the government should be out there telling people you must get married or whatever it is. But somehow to reverse engineer the problems that I think the government did create would be a really smart thing to think about. And surely there's something in between the two.
Well, we already have tax breaks. If you're married, you get a tax break. If you own a home, you get to deduct the mortgage on the interest on the mortgage. So the government does have a kind of a choice architecture, that nudge idea. We nudge people to be homeowners by giving them a tax break. Or electric cars. You get a tax break in California here if you have an electric car. And the federal government lets you take, a huge chunk off your income if you have an electric car. That's the government's way of kind of, without being too invasive, nudging us in a certain direction. But that assumes we think being married, having a home, having children is a good thing. Driving electric cars is a good thing. I guess nationally we make those kind of collective decisions. This is the direction we want to go in the next 50 years or whatever.
I just think that's just the government incentivizing being rich. Like, it's so disgusting. These electric cars are so expensive. Like, come on. It's just so gross. And meanwhile, in California, I mean, you guys actually have like energy Jim Crow, you know? It's like the new redlining where the electricity is getting so expensive that like 20 to 40% of Black Californians are paying like something like 10-20% of their income in electricity costs. It's really the let them eat cake of the 21st century to me, is a lot of this liberal policy on the environment.
That's too funny. I guess maybe I shouldn't tell you what kind of car I drive. No, we'll just leave that to the side. But I want everybody to have a Tesla. Everyone should drive an electric car, and they are coming down in price. And now that Elon's turned the corner, everybody, Ford, GM, Porsche, BMW, they all have electric cars, and they're all going to be $35,000 to $50,000, just like a Toyota Corolla would be. That's the direction, I think. Before we go down the road of bashing us electric car drivers, in the long run, and Elon says that the electricity comes from the electricity ferry, that we don't need more fossil fuel plants. No. Okay. All right. Let's. I had another. Oh, okay. So point number 2, mass incarceration. Okay, are there studies that show for sure the system is racist, or is it that because drugs are illegal and it's this kind of drug trade, and that poor and people of color are more likely to be involved in that because it's a way to make money because they can't make money otherwise, and the government has made it illegal, so they're more likely to be targeted? Or is that also true? And in sentencing, a judge looking at a white person versus a black person for the exact same crime gives a higher sentence to the black person?
That is my understanding. And in New York, you saw it really bear out with things like stop and frisk, where, over 90% of the people stopped were Black or Latino, and over 70% of the stops yielded nothing. And so it's not even like they were actually doing anything. They were just being racist and just humiliating, young men of color, which of course, does not make them, feel better about being law abiding. And so I think it's both things. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then,
and that's not to deny that the majority of violent crime takes place in these communities. It does. I mean, it does. And I don't need to deny that to recognize that the disparities are also there. And I think that that's an important thing to be able to say. That seems like neither side, wants to be able to make that nuanced point. Like, yes, it's true that Heather McDonald is correct. Like, that is where a lot of that violent crime is taking place. But there's an amazing book by a woman named Jill Leovy called Ghetto Side. And what she found was that Black and Latino communities are both over-policed for misdemeanors and under-policed when it comes to violent crime. And the clearance rate for murder, for example, in the Black community is half what it is for murder in the white community. And that's because of the over-policing. These people do not trust the police to protect them from the gangs, and so they will not participate in trying to solve these murders. And so those things really go hand in hand, I think.
Yeah, the stop and frisk example is a good example of a statistical artifact, because it was implemented right around when the crime wave peaked and started to go down in 93 and just plummeted for the next 20 years. So whatever you're implementing at that time gets the credit, even though that wasn't the case, because if you drill down, right, that they weren't discovering more weapons or drugs or whatever. It's a little bit like the studies done on, I use this example of regression to the mean. That is, you have kind of a mean average here and a cycle of performance up and down above the mean. So if you're studying the relative influences of punishments versus rewards on performance, so somebody that let's say peaks and you don't do anything, but then they're in the trough, so you punish them for scoring below the performance, then their performance gets better. But the performance was going to get better anyway because they were in the trough, and they're going to regress back to their mean performance. So then the punishment is punishment works, and you praise them at the top of the peak, and then their performance goes down because it's regressing to the mean. It's just a statistical artifact, and I think that that explains a lot of things. One of my books I use in my class is Leonard Mlodinow's book, The Drunkard's Walk. So much of life is explained by these statistical artifacts, but we look for deeper causes. What's the deep cause, the deep root cause? Okay, education is your third point. So would you be in favor of like school choice, vouchers, things like that, so that people of color parents have more options? Or what's the solution to this problem?
Yeah, definitely. And one of my biggest complaints with conservatives and Republicans right now is, the Democrats have clearly abandoned the Black community. Like, where are you guys? You should be in there every day saying, I'm showing up, in Oakland and I'm running on school choice. I'm going to get your kid into the best school that you choose, and I'm going to make sure that they get there safely and that, there's law and order in the streets. Like that is a winning argument. They might not win right away. They might have to lose a few times, but their abandonment of the Black community to the Democrats who use them and ignore them, it's really shameful. And there's such an opportunity now, because this wokeness is so at odds with the actual needs of the Black community. And so I'm really hoping, I get invited to speak to a lot of conservative, radio hosts, whatever, audiences, because they like the anti-woke message of my book. And I'm always saying, but where are you? Like, what is your excuse for not showing up and offering parents that I think, we're seeing right now that parents are a real constituency, and they're not going to be talked down to by a bunch of overeducated elites. They know what's right for their kids, and they want, they're going to vote for whoever welcomes them into being, part of that process. And that fits very much with Shelby Steele's point about, the breakdown of the family. One of the reasons that charter schools are so much more successful is because of the demands that they make on the parents. They're extensive. And that's also why the liberal elites don't like them. They consider that to be insulting, to say to parents, look, you have to show up for your kid. You have to be involved in this process or it's not going to work. But, of course, there's a real dignity that you give them in that, in treating them with that kind of respect. And again, it comes down to autonomy, saying, look, you have to step up and we're going to help you do that. And this is how you do it. So, yeah, I definitely would support school choice. I think our public schools should be a good option as well. But to me, I look at how much money is going into the public schools and how terrible they are, despite how much money is just being sunk into them. And I feel like there's, something is really, really amiss. And I'm not qualified to say what exactly it is or whether it could be solved. But in the meantime, I'm sure as heck going to support, parents choosing for their kids.
Yeah, I had a education reformer on here, Chris Edwards, who writes for Skeptic, and he was pointing out, at least in many states, it's a zip code system. So your kid goes to whatever zip code, the school, whatever is in your zip code. And so this leads to this kind of balkanization of, parents buying more expensive homes because the school in that district is a better school. And this is right on the real estate sheet for the house. This is the school district your kids could go to, and here's the rating, and this is why this house costs $100,000 more than the exact same house, 3 blocks away that's on the other side of the line.
Right.
And and this sets up a feedback loop. So the properties get more and more expensive, the school gets more money, the school gets better, and then the opposite direction in the other neighborhoods. And short of if you just open it up and said you can send your kid to whatever school you want, well, everyone's going to want to go to the good school now. And they're going to have too many applicants, and no one's going to want to go to the crappy school. So what are those teachers going to do? And so on. I don't know the solution to that other than just stop doing that. But what's the solution? I don't know. School choice voucher, something like that. But then you'd have to deal with the teachers' unions who say, no, we don't want this because what's going to happen to the jobs of those teachers where, there's half the students that they used to have.
Yeah, I think that the teachers union has given unions a really bad name, especially throughout the pandemic, where they just kept siding with the moral pieties of their liberal teachers against the poor Black and Hispanic kids who they're supposed to be teaching. And you're seeing now the numbers of the learning loss, to where just the racial gap that has widened over the last 2 years. It's just disgusting, and it's just disgusting. And I can't. I don't really understand how. I don't think that there's certain, it doesn't really make even sense for somebody who's employed by the government to be in a union. It doesn't make sense to me for somebody who makes, $120,000 a year to be in a union. But for some reason they, manage to sort of hold these governments, hostage. And I just think that we're going to see, I don't know how long it's going to take for liberals to see the cost of this on the most vulnerable. But every day it seems like there's new information coming out, the learning loss, the deaths of alcoholism, the overdoses, all of this stuff driven and amplified by the lockdowns, which we know now from this Stanford study, from the Johns Hopkins study, that the lockdowns did not actually save that many lives. I think it was 0.2%. So, what was the cost of that? What was essentially a class divide, again, that was dressed up as sort of a moral precept.
Yeah, it's easy for people like you and me to sit here in our home studios with our laptops working. But if I had to go somewhere
Exactly.
and it was shut down, what am I going to do? I don't know. Yeah, that's a problem. Huge economic costs. I think we won't know the full cost of that for probably years or decades to come on the economy. We'll need some of those macroeconomists that study that sort of thing, which leads me to your fourth point, intergenerational wealth disparities and poverty. This is an even harder one. For that and education, would you endorse something like a UBI or a reparations one-time payment or something that just kind of kickstart poor people into having something to invest? We know from investment studies, it's easy to get your money to make money if you have something to start with. You buy 100 shares of an S&P 500 mutual fund, and 40 years later, you're going to have millions of dollars. But there's a lot of people that can't afford 100 shares of anything. They can't afford to pay the rent next month. So how do we get them to even get started on the escalator up toward prosperity?
Yeah, these are really hard questions. I don't support UBI because to me, that is very anathema to a sort of strong working class agenda. I think something that people don't really realize is that things that are good for the poor are not necessarily things that are in the interest of the working class. The working class, they're not into handouts. People who are working class, they tend to really oppose that kind of thing because they believe in autonomy. They want good jobs that give them dignity, but they want to work for what they make. And, one of the biggest unions in America opposes paid leave, paid time off. And as the head of the union told me, he said, my workers don't want to be paid for a single minute of work that they didn't do. They want to be paid well for the work that they did do. Yeah. And I think we have what looks like a debate about economics in America, but actually really isn't. It's the elites competing. So you have like the Republicans who support this sort of trickle down, nonsense that, has really immiserated the poor and allowed corporations to amass, look at COVID, right? The largest transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class to the elites and to corporations in American history. But then what you have from the Democrats is what they're pushing is UBI, an expanded welfare state, which is also anathema to the economic interests of the working class. Like what the liberals want is for the working class to be subsumed under the category of poor, of people who live at their beneficence, right? Who live on, who get paid $2,000 a month to not work, right? To stay home and not work. That's the fantasy out of Silicon Valley, right? And that's sort of increasingly what you hear people like Nancy Pelosi and like what the Squad pursuing, which is just a very robust welfare state that includes, a very expanded list of benefits for an expanded list of Americans, right? And that is very anathema to working class values. It's anathema to having a strong, robust working class that gets dignity and wealth from its labor. And I think the reason that they want that, not the reason they want it, but one of the byproducts is if you're not contributing to the economy, you don't really have political power. I think that's why the poor is so disenfranchised, but also increasingly why the working class is, because we had these stagnating wages. And so they stopped being seen as a constituency that you had to answer to, because this country is so entrepreneurial in spirit and so, obsessed with that. And so to me, the liberals wanting conservatives, wanting Republicans, wanting the working class to be sort of welfare recipients, it's a way of sort of creating like a sort of feudal society, really, where they are serfs who then don't hazard, to voice their desires or their opinions because they're living sort of, at the beneficence of these liberal elites, these rich liberal elites. And, liberals love paying taxes. They're happy to pay higher taxes. And they think that that makes them better people. I think that that's like proof of, how they believe in equality. But of course, it's the opposite, right? They are so rich and hoping to get so much richer that they are happy to pay off. It's like the new indulgences, right? Like, just tell me what tax bracket I have to pay. I'm happy to pay for it, because they're already so much higher, so higher above like the lower classes. So I'm very against universal basic income. I do support reparations. I do think that we have a debt that we never paid, and I know it would be difficult to pay it. I know it will be difficult to do it, but the fact that we didn't do it when we should have done it is not an excuse to not do it now. And I'm not smart enough to know how to go about finding out who has a legitimate claim to having been a slave, having been put through that, having had their property stolen from them during Jim Crow. But I do feel that there is a moral debt to be paid, and I do think it would go a long way towards addressing the 20 to 30% of descendants of slaves who are living in that intergenerational poverty that they just can't seem to escape. But I'm not smart enough to know how to. All of the objections to reparations are very legitimate, and so I hear those objections, and I'm not quite smart enough to know how to answer them all, but I do feel that the moral debt has never been paid and the economic debt has never been paid, and I would like to see it paid in my lifetime. It's something I as an American would like to do. And yeah.
Right. And would you include Native Americans in that as well, given how much they lost to?
Yeah.
It seems like once you go down the pathway, you'd have to do that. And the argument that the government can't just cut everybody a check. Well, apparently they can. They just did the last 2 years to the tune of a couple $1 trillion in payroll protection to businesses and individuals. Yeah. So, but of course, again, I'm not smart enough either to know what the long-term consequences economically would be, say, for inflation. We may be experiencing the inflation now as a result of the bailouts during COVID, maybe. It's hard to say. And that could happen too with either a UBI or reparations. Yeah, it's those are hard questions. It does seem like there's a moral issue there. It's not the same as, say, Jews or Irish or Germans coming to America in the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s versus Africans brought here centuries before enslaved. That does seem different.
Yeah.
When you say you were woke, I was woke, so you're not woke anymore. What does woke mean, and what does it mean now that it's become pejorative?
I think it means that for a while I was sort of, let me put it this way. When I read the Yale study that found that white liberals dumb down their speech when they speak to Black and Hispanic Americans, and that white conservatives don't do that, I had this moment where I instantly recognized my entire milieu in that. And it was so jarring, and I knew it was such an indictment of my entire worldview that I literally put it away. I remember exactly where I was sitting, and I said, I'm not ready to think about this yet, but this is going to be big, and I'm not quite ready. And it did indeed mean, like, I had a premonition that I was going to lose a lot of friends over this, and that the course of my intellectual life was about to shift. Like, that was the power of seeing that study. And I knew it was coming, and I put it away. I couldn't look at it for a long time. I wish I could tell you, like, I instantly, the scales fell from my eyes and I had this, but it took me a long time to come back to it and say, okay, this is real, and this is true, and this is something that everybody I know does, who's on that side of things. And I have to examine the worldview that leads to doing that, because it's a sick worldview that makes you, the minute you meet somebody Black or Latino, your instant reaction is, this person needs my help. They're less competent than me. They need to be protected from my big vocabulary. I have to simplify things for them. They're not as educated as me. They need my help and my generosity and my beneficence, and I am above them in some way, and they are below me just because of the color of their skin. I mean, that's the woke worldview, I would say, encapsulated in that. And it's despicable. And the worst part is people do it because they think they're good people. Like, they think that this is how you are a good person. Like, this is how you express your virtue. So there was like a lot of soul searching after that when I was ready to do it.
Was that around this time you identify in your book at 2014, The Great Awakening, in the middle of Obama's second term?
No, it was much later. I mean, the Yale studies from 2018. So I was definitely, I had done the woke like pathway. I wasn't woke in grad school, but I sure as heck got woke while I was a journalist. And 2014, I was still writing articles about how affirmative consent is bad for women, because it's sort of uh, dehumanizing, and it sort of creates in them. It suggests that they have so much less agency than they need, and it's an erasure of sexuality and flirtation, which are like the very important to the perpetuation of the species. So I guess like I was still not quite woke then, at least on gender issues. But you know. And I would say in the beginning of the Trump era, I was still definitely, had the Trump derangement syndrome and had to be sort of nudged out of that slowly but surely. So it happened later, like 2018.
Interesting. So, is it that you started to see some of the points that Trump was making, or is that the way he was treated was not fair in the media? I mean, his accusation of fake news, there was a lot of fake news, that Trump derangement syndrome is real, right? I mean, he's not Hitler, okay, right? And yet he was treated. I mean, Barry Weiss makes this point when she was at the New York Times and then left. You quote her in your book, basically saying, that the 7,268th op-ed against Trump, maybe we should cover something else. And yeah, maybe that's around that time.
I mean, I think 2016, 2017, I was still knee deep in it. I was working as an opinion editor. I was running defenses of Trump, but none of them really penetrated. I have to say that the thing that got me out of it was my rabbi, who he's the best person I know. I mean, he'll walk down the street in the winter, and if he sees a homeless person, he'll start taking his clothes off and giving them to this homeless person. And one day over Shabbat dinner, Trump's name came up, and he went, "Oh, I love that guy."
Whoa.
And that was it. I mean, I was like, "You mean you voted for him?" And he was like, "No, I love him. I think he's great." And it was that I tell people a lot, like I don't think you can really change people's minds with information and data. The way you change people's minds is by being a person who is so virtuous that they can no longer think every person who thinks this thing that you think is a racist, or everybody who thinks this thing hates the poor. Like it not because they're necessarily convinced by the data, but because like they're convinced by, the fact that you are trying your best to be a good person and you still think that. And that's kind of my friend had a similar experience. She was on a group vacation, and she always really, really, really hated Trump. And on this group vacation, there was one woman who was sort of older and overweight and much slower than everybody else. So they would go on these walks or these hikes or these tours, and she would always be lagging behind. And there was one man who would always wait for her and always stop for her and always help her up. And with a big smile on his face, he like everybody complained about her over the meals, but he always made her feel like, it's no problem. She would be like, "I'm so sorry." And he would be like, "It's no problem at all. I'm winded too." And my friend was really impressed by this. And then one night over dinner, she heard him saying to the person he was sitting with, "Yeah, I voted for Trump. I think he's great."
Oh
and
God.
She had a very similar thing where she was like, I was faced with like, the cognitive dissonance of being like, well, either I couldn't say he wasn't doing this for her. He was doing it for her, and I'd been seeing it for a whole week. And then he said he liked Trump, and suddenly was like just the magnitude of his virtue coming up against her preconceived notions about what every Trump voter was like. It was the death of her. She still hates Trump, but that was the last time she ever said everyone who voted for him is racist. And I think that's a really powerful thing to a reason to strive to, if you want to change people's minds, like the best thing you can do is be good.
Right, exactly. Well, that's your religious upbringing. Were you raised Jewish? Your parents are, you said you were born in Israel?
I was raised very, very religious. And then I was very secular for many years. And then, one finds one's way back,
You
I
did?
guess.
But this is after Berkeley.
Yeah, when I was at Berkeley, I was still secular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so let me ask you, I ask all my Jewish friends this. Why aren't you a Christian? Why don't you accept Jesus as the Savior? You believe in the same book, at least the Old Testament, and the same God, Yahweh. And you even think there's going to be a Messiah. You just don't think it's Jesus of Nazareth. Why not?
It's such a great question. Probably if I was raised Christian, I would be Christian, I would have probably, knowing my personality, would have had the same thing, like turned 18, become secular for, however many years, and then found my way back to it. I think it's just your upbringing. I mean, you're just, you know, you reach for the things that feel right and feel comfortable and feel like, I mean, I think a lot of the values of conservatism, I'm not a conservative, I'm a lefty, but, you know, home, family, place, rootedness, religion, like these things kind of go together in the working class very much in America. They're sort of the opposite of that kind of credentialed meritocratic elite that's sort of ruling the, the waters that I swim in now, the intelligentsia. And so I think those things really go together. And so religion is not really an intellectual pursuit so much as it is, one of, I see why those are sort of associated with each other. It seems to me like it would be weird to belong to a religion that your ancestors didn't practice. And I think actually probably for a lot of Jews, like being religious is about honoring the sacrifices that the ancestors made for the right to be religious. It seems rather churlish to, in such a free nation, to to say, oh, actually, I'm not going to do that because I don't feel like it, when so many of them died, on the altar for the right to be Jews. So it would seem, yeah.
Well, that list you just rattled off, home and family and all that sounds conservative, but you're liberal. So there must be a need for another division, a little cut. There's sort of the woke progressive left that are illiberal.
Yeah.
Then there's the left of center liberals in the old school sense. And then maybe there's the just to the right of center, that kind of George Will, Charles Krauthammer, Mitt Romney, John McCain, conservative, and then there's the sort of Trumpers to the right. Or I don't know. I don't even know where Trump goes because he's not really a Republican or conservative. He's a Trumper, whatever that is, and or something like maybe we need 4 cuts along the way.
Yeah, I really think that Trump exploded the right-left divide because, like, on economics, he was so far to the left. I mean, he really implemented everything Bernie Sanders had been agitating, not everything, but, getting rid of NAFTA, trade war with China, tariffs, policing the border. This was all stuff that Sanders in 2016 had been pushing. But he was really, I think he was like a Marxist socialist. He saw everything as a class war the way that I do. And so I thought that he was very left wing on economics, and he was not very right wing on cultural issues either. So I think that he really did explode those differences. Like I have there's the populist right in America is twice as big as the progressive left, but you'd never hear about them. The people who are in that sort of, in the box, right, in that top right-hand corner where they're sort of socially conservative, but economically what's called liberal, but isn't really, but whatever, right? They're a sizable constituency in America, and they have nobody speaking for them or to them. And Trump, realized that existed, And meanwhile, only 6% of Americans are progressives, but 100% of Democrats are now speaking to them and for them and about them. And so I do think we're due for a recategorization of stuff.
Yeah, you make the point in your book about what happened to Kansas. Well, Trump got them. Well, how come the Democrats abandoned them? Well, that's your whole thesis of your book. Yes, the elites. Yeah, that's a problem. So, what's kind of wrapping things up here? What's the future of journalism, given the long history you track in the book, the current problems, the divisiveness, social media? Do we need Facebook, et cetera, regulated? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm hoping to see the continuation of what's happening already, which is a mass consumer boycott of the news. I think that we have replaced, community and spirituality with information and knowledge. And there's nothing you can learn from CNN or the New York Times that you can't learn from walking down to the local bodega or going to church, or if you're not religious, going to volunteer somewhere in your community, spending time with young people and old people. And there's literally nothing you can learn from the news today that you need to know. I mean, watching the coverage of Russia and Ukraine, there's no difference between Fox and CNN. They're all just on the side of escalation and war. And, even with COVID, so much of what they told us turned out not to be true. And so I think, I'm hoping to see people just say no, because I think the American people are much better than the media, and we're much less polarized than the media wants us to believe. We're much less polarized than our politicians want us to believe. And I want to see people reclaiming that, what it means to be an American, because we're so united about the most important issues. And I want to see us reclaiming that. And I think the way to do that is to say no to the media.
Or maybe just more options, just hundreds or thousands of options. And then no one has too much of a dominance. But didn't you say in your book that the New York
Yeah.
Times subscription rate has gone up since Trump? I mean, he denounced them, and then all of a sudden they started making more money.
Yeah, they did, although now they're sort of in the decline. So I think the post-Trump boom is sort of waning. CNN it's totally fallen off. In fact, interestingly, and I go into this at length in the book why this is, but Fox News now is getting more Democrats watching it than MSNBC and CNN combined.
Oh my God.
And
really?
May shock you to learn that the number one show watched by Democrats is Tucker Carlson.
What?
And they're not hate watching it. It's that when the media went woke, working class liberals no longer had anywhere to get their news, and so they all went over to Fox. And contrary to what you'll read in the New York Times every day, the Fox News coverage, daytime for sure, is very, very moderate, very center of the road. I mean, they discussed me on economic issues. Today they were complaining that people who make under $20,000 a year didn't pay any income tax, and I'm like, are you kidding me? This is what you care about. But in terms of the news coverage, I think that they looked at the crazy that was coming out of CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times, and they thought, look, we can be crazy to the right, or we can leave that for the nighttime shows and we can just stay in the center. And that's what they did. And so, so I think you're starting to see, a decline in the New York Times. And of course, you're going to see that because the New York Times used to have this mass appeal, but now 91% of New York Times' readers are Democrats. And it's rich Democrats. They've only ever wanted ruling class readers. They've always been a reflection of ruling class norms. And, the problem with the ruling class is that it's small, right? Like there's only, 8, 9, 10 million, progressives in America. And the New York Times is soon going to have all of those as readers already. And at that point, they're going to have to figure out a new growth strategy.
Yeah, you had some numbers in here, trying to find it in your book about the advertising kits for the New York Times, like, how much it costs to, and then they brag about their readership and how much money their readers make because that's going to appeal to advertisers. It's pretty shocking.
Yeah, $196,000 a year is the average New York Times print edition reader in a now deleted media kit.
That's a lot of money. That is good. That's some good coin. Wow. Yeah.
Good money.
Yeah. That's not your average American for sure. What is the average per capita GDP? 48,000 or something like that now in America. 50,000.
I think that's right. Yeah, between 45 and 50.
So the New York Times average is 4 times the American average. That's telling. Yeah. I wonder what it is for the Wall Street Journal. I'm guessing they must be up there also, but they don't make any pretenses about that.
Yeah, their media kit was a little
bit. They
bit
brag about it.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right.
We're the Wall Street Journal. That's what we do. Okay. That's really funny. Oh, Batya, this is fascinating. You're one of the most interesting people I've ever had on the show. You are so thoughtful in so many of these topics.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Oh,
so what are you working on next?
Wow.
No, seriously. No, what do you must have many more books inside you. What's next on your research and writing agenda?
I want to write a book about the American South, which I think we don't really understand. I want to write a book about how Americans are less divided than we've ever been before. I want to write a book about the working class, just the sociological ethnography, because I think we don't understand that. A lot of things I'd love to do.
We're less divided than before. That doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, you mentioned the data about interracial marriage, and it's so funny. Like a lot of people will say that doesn't make you not racist if you don't oppose interracial marriage, and I always say, but it would make you racist if you did oppose it, right? Like they would accept that as evidence of racism if somebody is opposed to it, right? And now I think it's the latest data suggests that that 92% of Americans now have absolutely no problem with interracial marriage, which is essentially like total consensus on the issue. And it's just, how do we act like that didn't happen, like that shift didn't happen? It's the same thing with women's issues. Like, there's just no comparing the power that at least white collar women have in the office today compared to before the Me Too movement. Like, but we act like that never happened. We act like there wasn't a complete shift of, where the power lies and, when a woman and a man interact in a professional setting. And So I think that I think that the reason that we believe all of this nonsense, the reason we don't acknowledge these shifts is because people are getting power out of and getting money out of us, acting like these divides still exist, when the only divide in America that really still exists is a class divide, and it's growing.
Yes. It's the economy, stupid, as Clinton famously said. It's not,
Yes,
it's not race and
exactly.
gender, it's the economy. Yeah. Yeah, I recently had to take the Chapman University where I teach the sensitivity training, race and sex and discrimination sensitivity, one of these programs that all employees have to go through. And they're getting more sophisticated, so you can't just blow through it really fast because they have timers on each unit. So I have two windows open. I'm reading something, and then I wait for the clock to go, and then and I don't read any of the scenarios because I already know what the answer to every one of the scenarios are, which is call HR, turn it over to HR, let human resources take care of the problem. Because they're so lame. It's like, if you hear, and they name everybody, they have these international names, and so and so is bisexual, and so cisgender, and the cisgender so and so tells an off-color joke. What should you do? A, intervene and say that was wrong. B, tell all your friends about it. C, call human resources. Like, oh, let me see, what could it be? And then they try to be, and then they try not to be discriminatory about it. So, like, they have a female professor hitting on a male undergraduate student. It's like, yeah, that happens all the time. That never happened when I was an undergrad. Okay, because they don't want to say what the real problem has always been, and so on. And that, to me, it seems over the top. The president's a friend of mine. I said, is the reason you're doing this for all of us is because it's so lame? It's obvious. Is it because for legal reasons that if you get sued, you could say, hey, we sent that guy through the training program? And he said, yeah, that's it. Yeah. And now corporations are all doing that, right? They send their employees through these, implicit bias training programs that Harvard has that program, the implicit association test, which has been debunked. But I still see it quoted over and over and over, showing that we are all unconsciously biased and racist. And, it's not true. At least not by that test. And yet, I think my sense is that corporations don't really believe this. I don't think they really want to go full woke. My sense is that they feel like they have to, either legally or, kind of the optics of it. Like this when Starbucks shut down for a day and sent all their employees through the training program because of that one manager in one of the Seattle stores that called the police on the two African Americans. That person right there, that's the problem, not the 75,000 employees or 750,000 employees or whatever it is, right?
Totally.
Too much. All right, Batya, thank you so much. I hope the book does really well. It's great. I love seeing many of your media appearances, which is why I wanted to have you on the show. And man, we went well over 2 hours. This is like this may be the record for my show. I'm not yet ready to go full Joe Rogan at 4 hours and get you to talk about UFOs and other conspiracy theories, but it's fascinating stuff. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2024. Are you worried about the 2024 election and how divisive it might be, or do you think things will settle down by then?
No, I think things will settle down. Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, prognostication is a fool's errand, but I can't imagine that Trump is the nominee when you have someone like DeSantis outperforming him in every way, and Trump getting crazier and crazier every day. I mean, even his own supporters say to me all the time, his moment has passed. He did something really important, like he really should have. He should have understood that his legacy was big, and so I don't feel worried at all. I wouldn't feel worried if it was him. Like I don't think. I think it's weird that journalists feel worried about things like that. Like it's just seems weird to me. Like we're not supposed to be so clearly on one side or the other. So I don't. I'm not worried. No, I think
not Putin.
I think this is a great nation, and we'll find our way.
Even the craziness of January 6th, 2021. By the end of the day, Congress was back in session, and they took their vote, or they did the count, or whatever that was with the Electoral College thing. By the end of the day, it was all done, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, that's not a coup. Nothing like that. This happened in Russia has happened here. So, yeah, the system seems to work pretty well. All right, Batya, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much.